In March of 2024, the Environmental Protection Agency stood behind a podium and announced the most aggressive vehicle emission standards in American history: 85 grams of CO2 per mile by 2032, cut in half from where we started. The models said we'd need somewhere between 30 and 56% of all new cars sold in America to be electric within 8 years. The room applauded. The press releases flew. And across Detroit, engineers quietly pulled up their calculators, ran the numbers, and started updating their resumes. Because here's what nobody at that podium mentioned. The gap between a government projection and engineering reality isn't a policy debate, it's a graveyard. And $52.1 billion in automaker losses are buried in it right now. Today I'm going to show you exactly how that graveyard got built, who dug the holes, and why you're probably standing in one without realizing it. I need to be honest with you before we go any further. 2 years ago, I was defending these emissions targets online like they were settled science. I believed the projections. I believed the infrastructure would materialize on schedule. I believed the cost curves would bend fast enough to make this work. Then I actually sat down with the engineering data, the grid capacity reports, the consumer surveys, and I realized I wasn't defending policy analysis. I was defending a narrative that made me feel like I was on the right side of history. That's a dangerous place to build your identity, and I'm going to show you exactly why. What's coming will make supporters of these rules uncomfortable. It will make opponents uncomfortable too, because this isn't a story about whether electric vehicles are good or bad. This is a story about what happens when political timelines collide with physical reality, and the people caught in between get crushed while both sides argue about who's morally superior. Let's start with the people who genuinely supported these rules, because their arguments weren't crazy. The climate math is real. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Tailpipe pollution kills people. The technology exists. Battery costs have been falling for a decade. China already crossed 50% electric and plug-in hybrid market share by late 2025. The International Energy Agency estimates EVs hit 25% of worldwide auto sales that same year. Global EV sales grew 20% to 20.7 million units. Europe was up 33%. The rest of the world up 48%. If other countries can do this, the argument went, America is just choosing not to. Environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council argued these standards would prevent hundreds of millions of tons of additional CO2 emissions. They had modeling to back it up. They had legal precedent. And they had moral urgency that's hard to argue with when you're watching glaciers collapse in real time. On the other side, you had automakers, dealers, and workers who looked at the same data and saw something terrifying. Not the destination, but the timeline. The United Auto Workers Union was pressuring Democrats during the 2024 election, worried about transition speed destroying jobs in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Dealers reported resistance to stocking EV inventory they couldn't move, and engineers inside the companies kept raising a question nobody wanted to hear. What happens if consumers simply don't buy these cars fast enough? 46% of American EV owners surveyed said they'd likely switch back to gasoline vehicles. 26% of consumers cited expensive battery replacement as their top concern. 25% pointed to public charging availability. Range anxiety persisted despite improvements. These weren't climate deniers. These were people doing math on their household budgets and coming up short. Both sides had legitimate points. Both sides had real data. And both sides were talking completely past each other because the conversation was never actually about engineering. It was about identity. And that identity gap is where $52 billion went to die. Here's what the EPA rule actually required. The final standards, signed in April 2024, mandated an industry-wide average of 85 grams of CO2 per mile by model year 2032. That's down from 170 grams per mile starting in 2027. The rules were technically technology neutral. Automakers could comply however they wanted. Hybrids, plug-in hybrids, efficiency improvements, electric vehicles, whatever combination worked. But the EPA's own modeling showed the most cost-effective compliance path required: 30 to 56% EV adoption by 2032, depending on manufacturer strategy. The original proposal had been even more aggressive, suggesting 67% EV sales. Political pressure from unions and swing state Democrats forced a more flexible final version. The Biden administration was caught between climate ambition and electoral survival, and the compromise satisfied neither side completely. That's what the policy said on paper. Now here's what happened when it hit reality. January 2025, the Trump administration took office and immediately signaled intent to roll back climate regulations. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin announced plans to rescind the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding and reconsider Biden-era vehicle emission rules. But the real earthquake wasn't regulatory, it was financial. The federal EV tax credit expired September 30th, 2025. What followed was a case study in how incentives distort markets and what happens when they vanish. Third quarter 2025 saw a record 10.5% EV market share as buyers stampeded to claim credits before the deadline. Then Q4 arrived. Sales collapsed 36% year over year. The sugar rush ended, and the hangover was catastrophic. Full year 2025 EV market share landed at 7.8%, down from 8.1% in 2024. Not up, down. In a year when the trajectory was supposed to be accelerating toward 30% and beyond, the market went backwards. North America became the only major region on Earth with declining EV sales, -4%, while the rest of the world surged. That's not a policy failure. That's a reality check delivered with a sledgehammer. And the automakers who had bet tens of billions on the government's projections holding were about to pay the price. Ford went first. $19.5 billion in EV-related write-downs. They canceled the all-electric F-150 Lightning, dissolved their battery joint ventures. In 2024 alone, Ford lost $5.1 billion on its EV division, with projections of $5 to $5.5 billion more in 2025 losses. General Motors took $6.6 to $7.6 billion in charges, scaling back but continuing investment at reduced levels. But the number that should make your stomach drop belongs to Stellantis, $26 billion. The largest EV-related loss in automotive history. Stellantis publicly admitted they, quote, overestimated the pace of the energy transition, end quote. Combined, Ford, GM, and Stellantis absorbed $52.1 billion in EV charges in late 2025 and early 2026. That's not an abstraction. That money came from somewhere. It came from canceled factory expansions, from delayed product launches, from workers who were promised the future and handed a pink slip. And while Detroit was hemorrhaging cash, something interesting was happening in Congress. The so-called Big Beautiful Bill repealed multiple emission standards and green energy programs. The EPA kept 2026 standards in place while officially reconsidering everything from 2027 forward. The regulatory certainty that automakers needed to plan 5- and 10-year product cycles evaporated overnight. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable, and I need you to stay with me because this is the part that matters. While federal policy was collapsing into chaos, California's Air Resources Board maintained its Advanced Clean Cars 2 program, requiring 68% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2032. Roughly 35% of all U.S. auto sales fall under California-aligned state rules. So now you have two Americas. One where the federal government is dismantling emission standards, and one where a coalition of states is accelerating them. A two-tier market. Legal battles brewing over California's Clean Air Act waiver authority, and every single automaker trying to build cars that somehow satisfy both realities simultaneously. Meanwhile, the real winners of this chaos weren't electric vehicle makers or traditional automakers. They were the hybrid manufacturers. 45% of Americans said they'd consider a hybrid, compared to 34% considering a pure EV. Plug-in hybrids and extended-range electric vehicles, basically electric motors with a gas generator backup, started gaining traction as the bridge technology that both sides could tolerate. Toyota's long-standing hybrid strategy, mocked for years as timid and backward, suddenly looked like the most prescient bet in the industry. Now here's what nobody is telling you, and this is the part that should make you angry regardless of which side you're on. The companies and politicians pushing the hardest for aggressive EV timelines already got paid. Billions in subsidies, billions in tax credits, billions in government-backed loans for battery factories that are now being delayed or downsized. They didn't care whether the grid could handle it. They didn't care whether consumers could afford it. They cared about capturing the money while it was available. And the people defending those timelines online, arguing in comment sections and sharing policy papers, were doing it for free. You were an unpaid lobbyist for politicians who will never drive the EVs they mandated and corporations who already cashed the subsidy checks. That's you. If you spent the last 3 years arguing that anyone questioning the 2032 timeline was a climate denier, you weren't analyzing policy. You were performing loyalty to a narrative constructed by people who had financial incentives you never examined. And if you spent those same years arguing that electric vehicles are a scam and the whole thing is a hoax, you were doing the same thing in reverse, defending oil industry talking points planted through the same tribal machinery. Both sides got played. The manipulation just came from different directions. Teaching yourself to ignore engineering reality whenever it conflicts with political narrative doesn't go away when the policy changes. That reflex stays with you. And right now, it's keeping you from seeing what's actually happening. I talked to a guy last month. I'll call him Marcus. 43 years old, worked at a parts supplier in Ohio for 16 years. When the EPA rules were announced, his company pivoted hard to EV components. Marcus believed in it. He defended the transition online, told skeptics they were on the wrong side of history. He retrained, learned new manufacturing processes, convinced his wife they should buy an EV with the tax credit before it expired. They stretched their budget to make it work. Then the credits disappeared. His company's biggest customer, one of the Detroit Three, slashed EV production orders by 40%. Marcus got laid off in November 2025. His EV had already depreciated more than he expected, and the public charger nearest his house was broken for 3 weeks straight. When he posted about his experience online, about feeling abandoned by the companies and politicians who promised this transition would work, he got called a climate denier, a shill for oil companies. Someone told him he deserved to lose his job for being weak. Marcus told me something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, "I didn't just lose my job. I lost the story I was telling myself about the future. I did everything they asked. I retrained. I bought the car. I defended the policy. And when it fell apart, the same people who convinced me called me the enemy for noticing." Let that sink in. He's not anti-EV. He's not anti-environment. He's a guy who trusted a timeline that was never based on engineering reality, and when he said so out loud, the tribe he thought he belonged to turned on him. Here's the financial reality that won't go away no matter who wins the next election. The industry just lit $52 billion on fire chasing projections that were politically motivated, not engineering validated, and your next car is going to cost more because of it. Here's the relationship cost. I know people who stopped speaking to family members over EV policy disagreements, defending timelines neither side will live long enough to see fully implemented, burning real human connections over regulatory projections that got revised 6 months later. And here's the psychological damage that outlasts all of it. You trained yourself to treat policy positions like religious doctrine, to attack anyone who questioned the math, to confuse political loyalty with moral virtue. That doesn't disappear when the mandate gets delayed. So, tell me, do you support the EPA's original emissions timeline, or do you oppose it? I actually don't care about your answer. What I care about is this. Can you name one legitimate concern from the other side? If you support the rules, can you acknowledge that the grid capacity data and consumer adoption rates present real engineering challenges? If you oppose them, can you admit that tailpipe emissions cause measurable harm and that some regulatory pressure accelerated genuinely useful technology? If you can't do that, if the idea of conceding a single point to the other side makes your chest tight, then congratulations. You're not analyzing policy. You're defending an identity that was manufactured for you by people who already got paid. And you're doing it for free.